Anakin follows the one who abducted Padme into a hangar, who he sees knock down the pilots and get into one of a couple fighters there prepared for a routine patrol. He attempts to revive the pilots, then grabs one of their helmets off the floor and hops into the other craft, and flies out after it. He follows the other ship as it descends towards the planet, following it down to the surface. He speaks to his droid, a little small and squat silver droid named AR-10. Anakin tells AR that he cannot fire on the ship because Padme is inside, but he continues to chase it through the tall ruddy rock formations which rise up from the expansive flats. He dives through rocky corridors and climbs back up into the sky, going over the plains of red dust and through the persistent rock formations which are scattered across the landscape. The creature in the front ship sees him pursuing him and fires back at him. Padme cannot do anything because her hands are bound, but she kicks and causes him to veer off. Anakin is able to avoid his shots, but as the ships veer close to the rocks, the forward ship causes a flock of birds to take flight. Anakin maneuvers to avoid the flock of birds and loses control of his ship, and they eject before the ship crashes into a vast floodplain. The creature is satisfied that Anakin's ship has crashed and Padme looks shattered and falls down lifeless. Anakin descends and comes to the ground, lifting himself up and calling out to AR. And AR comes rolling along on the ground to him, and he lifts him up, saying he is pretty tough. The robot speaks to him, and they make their way to the downed craft, which is a mile or so in front of them. Anakin evaluates it and identifies that it is still somewhat operational. Pretty tough too. Most of the systems are down, but he activates the distress signal, and they wait there. He looks around the landscape and then takes out his binoculars and looks around, but there isn't much out there but just rock. He isn't sure about food, but checks and finds emergency supplies to last a few days. Otherwise all around them is an expanse of dry desert going off for miles. Bay leaves the officials and goes off and locates DT outside the ship, asking if she'd seen the kids. She says they haven't returned, so he goes off and finds no sign of them anywhere. As it gets cold at night, Anakin climbs into the pod and closes the door, and as they are in there he sees frost begin to form on the windows. He wraps himself up, but there is no way of generating heat beyond the heat radiating from the craft itself. He sits there with AR, telling him how he attempted to save Padme but failed, and now he has no idea where she is or what is happening to her. He says that he was led astray from his intention by veering from the flock of birds, and that he has to learn not to allow distractions to get in the way of accomplishing what he's attempting to do. In the morning the ship is sitting there in the hot sun, and a land vehicle approaches, a tall one riding atop 4 supports on 8 wheels. They stop the craft and go down and study the downed ship and look around it. They are 2 little lizard men, inhabitants of the planet named Circers. Anakin comes out and looks at them, and they invite him to share their food and water sitting beneath their vehicle. They cannot understand one another, but while they are there they warn him about the Uggams, which they demonstrate have horns on their heads, and are a given height, and then of the Sorlog, which is even bigger still. Anakin says, as tall as that. He asks where the nearest settlement is. People like him, and they point, and if they can't take them with them, but they decline. He asks for water and they shell him a large bottle, and wish as payment either AR or his macro binoculars, so he gives them the latter. They motion off to the northwest, then tell him again, Uggams, Uggams. They go off on their way, driving off into the distance, and Anakin is left alone with AR. Later, Anakin has made a circle in the ground, and is tossing AR, and then the droid rolls back to him. Then a beeping sound comes from the ship. Anakin goes over to it, and it identifies the reception of his distress signal. Anakin then tells AR that they have received his distress signal, and there is nothing now to worry about. Then the robot begins to sign an alert, danger, danger. Then a shadow falls over Anakin from behind. He looks behind him and there is a tall 15-foot horn giant standing there. It reaches out and grabs Anakin by his shins and flips him back into his sack, then grabs AR and throws him in also. It walks back to a huge lizard with a long neck and tail extending from a carapace. Climbing upon its back he heads off. The giant arrives at the Uggam camp, and other Uggams arrive to see what he has brought. He takes the sack, turning it upside down, and dumping out Anakin and AR onto the ground. It picks up Anakin's bag and dumps out what is inside, including the lightsaber parts, which are scattered out over the ground. Picking a couple pieces up, they toss them away, seeing they are worthless, but he places a ring of metal upon his finger. He then picks up Anakin and places him into a large cage made of shafts of wood, with no shelter but for the tall rock that it is set against, and a nearby spindly tree. He is left there suffering in the sun during the heat of the day, while they take AR and play a kicking game with the little robot, knocking him back and forth on the ground. Anakin suffers from the sun and attempts to use his shirt to cover his head. After a while he is delirious, suffering in the heat, and without much energy left, and he looks out and sees something glinting in the sand. He looks again, recognizing it as the lightsaber parts. He then gets up and looks out at them, seeing them sitting out in the sand not far from the cage. He looks around and finds a long stick, and reaches it out through the bars, and is able to touch them, but cannot grab onto them. He hits the stick down in frustration, then he collects himself, and clears his mind. Focusing himself, he reaches out his hand towards them, and draws one of the parts into his hand using the force. He looks at the metallic piece in wonderment, and his own hand. Anakin then makes a commotion in the cage, and the one who found him comes over to him. Anakin holds up the lightsaber to it, and offers it to the Uggam. The creature reaches out his hand for it into the cage. Anakin then goes and grabs hold of the creature, and holds its hand, tugging the ring from off of its finger. The creature then lifts the top off of the cage, and takes a tree bough, and brings it crashing down to pulverize his little possession. But Anakin rolls away from him. Taking the ring, he attaches it to the lightsaber and then touches the activator switch. The saber ignites into a blade, and he rushes forward, severing the limb in two. The Uggam backs away as Anakin then lunges forward, and cuts through the cage with his blade. The Uggam calls out and then others emerge, and they come at him with their clubs, and he battles with them with their clubs, which he cuts off at their handles. The Uggams, seeing themselves defeated, run off in fear, away from their camp. Anakin watches them fleeing to their lizard mounts, and going away in haste. He then looks around the abandoned camp, and finds AR, dusting him off, asking if he's alright. Then tells him that even though he drove them away, they aren't really much better off. They don't know where they are, or where the ship is, even if someone does arrive. Saying these creatures must be the Uggams their little friends spoke of. And around AR are a number of other collected items there in a pile, and he reaches into the red sand, and pulls out his binoculars. He shakes off the sand and looks, and they still are operational. He walks over, picks up one of the severed Uggam clubs, and looking at it closer tells AR that the projections upon it are teeth, the largest of them a couple feet long. He guesses it might be the teeth of the Sorlog the two scavengers spoke of. Then he wonders how the Uggams got their hands on his binoculars. So then he tells AR to wait there, and runs up onto the rocks, and looks around with the binoculars and spots miles off the vehicle of the two scavengers. He comes down and tells AR that he spied the vehicle of the scavengers, telling him it is far off, and they will have to reach it before nightfall. He agrees, and they go off. Walking 5 miles or so in the still hot sun, they reach it, as it is getting close to freezing, and Anakin notices that around the vehicle are the tracks of another sort of creature, and that the Uggams must have ransacked the vehicle after something else had attacked it. He says the craft is sun-powered, so it should still work, and he climbs up the ladder with AR, and into the cabin. He is able to turn it on, and get some heat flowing into the cabin. Then drives the vehicle around, heading northwest towards the nearby settlement they pointed out to him, telling AR that they need to get a signal off to Bay. In the city of Tyrannus, Padme is brought before Lord Tyrannus, saying that he was the one who had her captured and brought here, because he was curious to discover precisely why the Queen of Naboo was to be found on his doorstep. She tells him that he kidnapped Anakin's mother, and he says that she is there, but asks why she would come after the Witch of Naboo, and then he recognizes that she has some sort of relationship with Anakin. Saying that this might change everything, he has her taken away, and put back into her cell.